At the hospital, I heard my son tell the doctor I was not worth saving, and in that single moment my world shifted forever. My heart heavy with the weight of words I never thought I would hear from the child I raised with everything I had. Yet, as I lay there staring at the ceiling with machines echoing around me, something inside me stirred, and what began that day would lead to a reckoning none of us could have foreseen. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I lay there in that sterile room with the steady hum of machines surrounding me, my body frail and my breath shallow, but my mind was sharp enough to catch every word that escaped his mouth. And those words echoed in my chest heavier than the weight of any illness. I had given everything I had to raise that boy, every drop of sweat, every ounce of strength, every dream I put aside so he could build his own. And yet as I lay helpless, clinging to life, I listened to him speak of me as though my life carried no value, as though my years of sacrifice meant nothing. The doctor had hesitated, his voice low and cautious as he explained the risks of further treatment, and before I could gather the strength to answer, my son stepped forward, his tone sharp, his words clear, saying I was not worth saving. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, the bright white lights blurring through the mist of my eyes, and feeling a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the sickness in my body. The doctor glanced at me briefly, and I could see the pity in his eyes, the discomfort of a man who had heard too much but was bound by his duty to remain neutral, and I wanted to shout, to tell him that I was more than worth saving, that I had lived my life with honor, that I had raised a son from nothing. But my voice would not rise above the frailty of my lungs. Instead, I lay in silence, hearing the sound of my son's decision echo louder than the beeping monitors, and I wondered how the boy I once held in my arms, the boy I comforted through every childhood fear, the boy I taught to walk, to read, to stand tall, could one day stand beside my bed and strip me of dignity with such ease. The words tore through me not because of what they meant in that moment, but because of what they revealed, that all my years of sacrifice had led to a son who valued me so little. I felt my heart breaking, but I also felt something else stirring beneath the pain, something colder, a clarity I had not known before, because in that moment I understood that my story was not going to end with his decision. I was not going to let his arrogance define the worth of my life, not after everything I had built, not after everything I had endured. I closed my eyes, not in surrender, but in a quiet vow that he would learn the truth of who I was and what I had given, and that the man he called not worth saving was far stronger than he could ever imagine. What followed after that moment would change both our lives, and it would reveal more about sacrifice, pride, and justice than he ever wanted to see. But as I lay in that hospital bed, the seed of resolve had already been planted, and in time it would grow into a storm he could not escape. When the words left my son's mouth, and I lay there weak and trembling in that hospital bed, the shock of betrayal coursed through me like a second illness, one that no medicine could cure. And as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the machines keeping watch over me, I could not stop replaying the sound of his voice, telling the doctor I was not worth saving. And though my body was frail, my mind spun in circles trying to comprehend how the child I had given everything for could discard me so easily. The sterile air of the room seemed heavier. The walls felt as though they were closing in, and I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry and my chest ached with each shallow breath. So instead, I was left in silence with my thoughts, thoughts that pressed harder against me with every second that passed. Had I truly raised a son who could think so little of me, who could erase my worth with a single sentence, who could look upon me in my weakest state and decide I was expendable? My heart wrestled with disbelief, because I remembered the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy I held close when storms rattled the windows, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle and who beamed with pride when I let go of the seat and watched him pedal forward on his own. That boy was gone, replaced by a man whose words pierced deeper than any illness could, and I struggled to understand when the transformation had taken place, when the love I had poured into him had turned into indifference. I thought back to the countless nights when I came home from work exhausted but still managed to sit by his side as he studied, the weekends I sacrificed to take him to his sports games, the times I went without new clothes so he could fit in with his friends, and all of it seemed to crumble before my eyes as his words echoed in my ears. The doctor's hesitation had been a test of compassion, but my son had failed it with a coldness I had never thought possible, and it left me questioning not only him, but myself, wondering if I had somehow failed as a father to instill the values of love and respect that should bind blood together. The shock of betrayal was not only in hearing his words, but in realizing that he believed them, that deep down in his heart he did not see me as a man who had built his life, but as a weight too heavy to carry. I tried to comfort myself with excuses, telling myself perhaps he spoke out of fear or misunderstanding, but the clarity of his tone and the certainty in his words left no room for doubt. As the hours passed and the lights of the hospital dimmed with the night, I stared into the darkness above me and felt as though I had lost something far greater than my health. I had lost the very bond that had defined my life for decades, the bond between father and son, and in its place remained only the hollow ache of betrayal. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. I wanted to sleep, but rest would not find me. I wanted to forget, but the words repeated in my head like a cruel refrain. And yet, beneath the sorrow, beneath the disbelief, something inside me began to shift, a small flicker of realization that though his words had wounded me deeply, they also revealed a truth I could no longer ignore, a truth that would shape everything that came after. The shock of betrayal left me broken in that moment, but it also marked the beginning of something else, the quiet birth of resolve. And while I was not ready to act, I knew the time would come when my son would face the weight of his words and understand that a father's worth cannot be erased so easily. As I lay there in that hospital bed reliving the sting of my son's words, my mind drifted back through the years, and I found myself walking again through the long corridors of memory where every moment of sacrifice played itself out before my eyes, because I could not think of his betrayal without remembering the countless things I had done to make sure he would never go without. I remembered the day he was born, the way his tiny fingers curled around mine, and the promise I whispered to him in that quiet room, a promise that I would protect him, provide for him, and never let him feel the emptiness of loss, even though life had already stolen so much from us when his mother passed too soon. I remembered working long shifts at the factory, the clang of metal echoing in my ears while sweat ran down my back, and every time I felt too weak to go on, I would picture his face waiting for me at home, and that image gave me the strength to finish the day. When bills piled high and money ran thin, I chose hunger for myself so he could eat. I chose worn-out clothes for myself so he could walk proudly into school wearing shoes without holes, and I chose sleepless nights so he could rest peacefully under a roof I fought desperately to keep above us. There were winters when the cold crept through the cracks of the walls, but I worked extra hours to buy him a heavier blanket, and there were summers when the heat pressed down on us, but I saved enough to get him a fan so he could sleep without discomfort, and through it all, I kept telling myself that every sacrifice was worth it if it meant he grew up with dignity. I remembered the mornings when I rose before dawn to pack his lunch, the evenings when I sat at the table with him, helping with homework even though my eyes burned from exhaustion, and the weekends I gave up resting so I could take him to practice, standing on the sidelines with pride as I watched him play. I sold the few heirlooms I had inherited just to pay for his school trips. I gave up my chance at advancement in my own career so I could work jobs that kept me close to home, and I traded every dream I once had for myself for the single dream of watching him succeed. When he went to college, I remembered taking out loans I could barely afford, walking into banks with trembling hands, promising to pay back money I knew would take years to cover, all so that he could walk through those doors and sit in classrooms that I never had the chance to enter. Every graduation photo on the wall is stained with my sacrifice. Every smile on his face was built from my exhaustion, and every achievement he boasts of is tied directly to the years I spent bending my back for him. I thought of the birthdays where I saved every penny just to buy him the toy he wanted, the Christmases where I went without gifts so that he would have something to open, and the nights when I sat alone, staring at overdue bills, wondering how much more I could give, and always deciding to give just a little more. My life was not filled with luxuries, but it was filled with the quiet pride of knowing I was giving my son everything I could, and though I sometimes felt invisible, I never doubted that he would one day understand the depth of my devotion. Yet as I lay in that hospital bed, remembering the years of sacrifice, I could not help but ask myself if he had truly seen me at all, if he had truly grasped the cost of the life he now lived, because the boy I raised with so much love had grown into a man who could look at me and tell a doctor I was not worth saving. The lifetime of sacrifice that once felt like a badge of honor now pressed against me like a cruel weight, because it seemed to have vanished into nothing in his eyes. But even so, I knew those sacrifices were real, and they were the foundation of my strength, the strength I would need for what lay ahead. As I lay reflecting on the years that had shaped my son's life, I could not separate the story of our bond from the endless stream of financial sacrifices that had defined my role as his father, because every step of his journey was paved with money I did not truly have, money earned from sweat and sleepless nights, money borrowed on faith, and money saved by denying myself the small comforts that others took for granted. I remembered clearly how the first tuition bills arrived in thick envelopes that seemed heavier than their paper should allow, and each time I opened one, I felt my chest tighten at the sight of numbers far greater than what I carried in my pocket. Yet instead of shrinking away, I pushed forward, working longer shifts and taking every overtime opportunity, because I would not allow him to miss a single chance at an education. I signed my name to loans that I knew could break me if he faltered, walking into banks with my old work jacket still smelling of sweat, explaining to stern faces that I only wanted a future for my boy, and though my hand shook as I signed, I told myself it was worth every risk. When rent came due for the small apartments he lived in while studying, it was my wallet that covered the gaps, my groceries that went untouched so his fridge would not be empty, and my savings that dwindled so he would never feel the shame of being unable to pay. I still recall the late nights I would sit at the kitchen table balancing bills, shifting numbers, deciding which of my own needs could wait, because his tuition, his housing, his textbooks, and his meals always came first. Later, when he spoke of starting a business, I reached once more into pockets already worn thin, helping him with deposits and small loans, believing his confidence and wanting to see him succeed, never questioning whether he valued the sacrifices behind those funds. I remembered the countless times he would call, his voice calm but insistent, asking for a little help here, a little more there, always promising to pay it back, promises that never came true but which I forgave, because I told myself that fathers are meant to give without keeping count. My savings for retirement, which could have offered me peace in my old age, slowly disappeared into his needs, and even when I grew ill and my body began to falter, I chose to prioritize his requests over my own treatments, convincing myself that there would always be time for me later. I think of the groceries I delivered to him when he was newly married, bags full of food I could barely afford for myself, but which I carried with pride because I wanted him to feel secure. I think of the co-signed loans I agreed to, my name standing beside his on contracts that gave him opportunities he could not have earned alone, and I think of the endless deposits I made quietly into his accounts, when I knew he was falling behind, never asking for thanks, never drawing attention to myself. Even the wedding that celebrated his new chapter carried my fingerprints. The deposits I made to secure venues, the checks I wrote with hands trembling not from regret but from fatigue, telling myself that seeing him happy was worth the emptiness of my account. And through all of it, I believed that love expressed through sacrifice would one day be remembered, that he would look back and understand that his entire life had been carried on the shoulders of a father who never once thought of himself first. But as I lay in that hospital bed hearing him tell the doctor I was not worth saving, I realized that the thread of financial sacrifice I had woven through his life had been invisible to him, unseen and unvalued, and though it broke me to accept it, I also knew that this very thread could be pulled away, unraveling the fabric of the security he had taken for granted. And in that realization I felt a strange calm, because the sacrifices that once chained me to his needs could also become the key to my freedom. Looking back now, I can see that the betrayal in the hospital did not arrive out of nowhere, because the first cracks in my son's character had shown themselves long before that moment. Small signs of disrespect and entitlement that I ignored at the time, convincing myself that youth and inexperience explained them, but which, in truth, were warnings I chose not to see because my love for him blinded me. I remember the way he would dismiss my advice when he was a teenager, rolling his eyes when I spoke about saving money or living with humility, acting as though my years of sacrifice were irrelevant in the face of his ambitions. At first, I told myself that all children push back against their parents, that it was normal for him to test his independence, but there was something colder in his tone, a kind of impatience that suggested he saw me as outdated, a man who belonged to the past rather than someone to be respected for his wisdom. Later, when he moved out to attend college, the phone calls that once carried gratitude began to change, becoming less about sharing his life with me and more about what he needed. He would call asking for money, for help with rent, for assistance with textbooks, always with the promise that he would pay me back or that it was just temporary, but never once with a question about how I was managing or whether I had enough for myself. I brushed it off then, telling myself that young people are often consumed by their own struggles, but each request left me a little more invisible. When he graduated, instead of thanking me for the sacrifices that had made his education possible, he boasted about how hard he had worked, how much he had achieved on his own, and though I smiled and clapped with pride, deep down I felt the sting of his lack of acknowledgement. As the years passed, and he built his life with the help of the funds I quietly supplied, I began to notice the way he introduced me to his friends or colleagues, not with pride, but with a kind of indifference, almost as though he was embarrassed by my simple clothes or my weathered hands. Once, at a dinner, I overheard him joke lightly about how I was always worrying about money, as if my careful budgeting was a flaw rather than the very reason he had never gone without. And though he laughed, the words cut deeply. His wife, too, began to mirror his behavior, treating my presence as an obligation rather than a blessing, and I realized then that he had painted me in her eyes not as the father who had built his life, but as a man to be tolerated. The first cracks widened when I noticed how quickly he grew impatient with me, how he brushed aside my attempts to connect, always rushing through conversations, always checking his phone as though my words were interruptions rather than pieces of my heart offered to him. I began to feel that my role in his life was shifting from father to financier, that my value to him was measured not in love but in dollars. And though I told myself I was imagining it, deep down I knew the truth. The final warning came one evening when I stopped by his home with bags of groceries, food I had purchased after a week of scrimping, and instead of gratitude he looked uncomfortable, muttering that I did not need to do that anymore, that they could handle themselves now, even as I knew my money was still flowing into their accounts to cover the very home he lived in. It was in those moments that the cracks began to spread, and though I covered them with excuses, convincing myself that he would outgrow this arrogance, they were the first signs of the collapse that would eventually reveal itself in that hospital room. Looking back, I see now that the boy I raised had been drifting away for years, and my refusal to confront those cracks allowed them to widen until the entire bond we shared broke apart with a single sentence to a doctor who asked if my life was worth saving. The day in the hospital is burned into my memory with a clarity so sharp it feels as though it happened only moments ago, because it was not just the sight of the sterile white walls, the steady hum of machines, or the sting of IV needles in my arm that made it unforgettable. It was the way my world collapsed in silence when my son spoke words that stripped me of dignity, words that turned every sacrifice I had ever made into nothing more than dust. I had been admitted after a sudden attack, my chest heavy and my body weak, and as I drifted in and out of awareness, I could hear the muffled voices of nurses moving swiftly, the clatter of instruments being prepared, and the firm but steady tone of the doctor explaining options for my care. I lay there with the oxygen mask pressed to my face, staring at the ceiling lights that glared down on me, listening as the doctor described the risks of further treatment and the possibility that intervention might not succeed, and before I could muster the strength to answer, my son stepped forward and spoke in a voice so calm, so deliberate, that it froze my blood. He told the doctor that it was not worth it, that I was not worth saving, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it, if my weakened state had twisted his words. But then I saw the way the doctor's eyes shifted toward me, filled with pity, and I knew it was real. I could hear the beeping of the heart monitor quicken, not because of my illness, but because of the shock and disbelief tearing through me. And I lay there helpless, unable to lift myself from the bed, unable to shout that he was wrong, unable to remind him of everything I had done for him, of everything I had given so he could stand there as a man. The room grew unbearably heavy, and though nurses moved in and out, their faces blurred by my tears, the only thing I could focus on was his voice. The voice of the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had protected from every storm, now turned into a weapon against me. The doctor hesitated. His pen paused over the chart, his eyes flicking back and forth between us, and in that pause I felt the finality of my son's judgment pressing down on me. I tried to speak through the mask, tried to force out words, but my throat was dry and my lungs burned, and nothing came but a weak rasp that went unheard. My son stood there, his expression unreadable, and I searched his face for any trace of the boy who once ran into my arms with joy, but I found none. Instead, I saw only distance, coldness, and certainty. That certainty broke me more than my failing health ever could. The machines beeped steadily, marking time as though mocking me, reminding me that my life was hanging in the balance not just because of illness, but because of the decision of the very child I had raised. I closed my eyes, not in surrender, but in grief. And in that darkness I felt a storm of memories wash over me. Every sacrifice, every meal skipped, every bill paid at my expense, every late night spent working, every early morning spent preparing for him, and all of it seemed to vanish under the weight of his words. It was as though the years of my life had been erased in an instant, replaced by a single cruel sentence. Yet beneath the crushing weight of sorrow, I felt a spark of something else, a quiet clarity that whispered to me that this was not the end of my story. Though my body was weak, and though I lay there unable to defend myself, my spirit stirred, and I knew that what he had done, what he had said, would not go unanswered. That day in the hospital was the day my heart broke, but it was also the day my resolve began to take shape, and though I did not know exactly how, I promised myself as I lay there in silence that he would come to understand that a father's worth is not measured by the arrogance of a son, but by the truth of the sacrifices that built his life. As I lay motionless in that hospital bed after hearing my son's words, what followed was not a storm of anger or shouting, but a silent collapse that echoed louder than any cry could. For while my body was already weakened by illness, it was my spirit that took the heaviest blow, and I felt as though the weight of an entire lifetime pressed down upon me until I could scarcely breathe beneath it. I stared at the ceiling tiles, their perfect white squares blurring together as my eyes filled with tears I could not let fall, and I listened to the steady beep of the machines that marked the passing of seconds, each sound reminding me that time was slipping away while my son's judgment hung in the air like a verdict that could not be appealed. I wanted to call out to him, to remind him of who I was, of what I had done, of the years I had given so that he could have the life he enjoyed, but my voice would not rise. And in that silence, I realized that perhaps no reminder would matter, because if he could stand by my side in that moment and declare me unworthy, then he had already erased me from his heart. The silence became unbearable, yet I did not break it, because deep inside I understood that speaking would only expose my weakness further, so instead I withdrew into myself, curling my spirit around the memories of sacrifice like a man clutching a blanket in the cold. I thought of the nights when I had returned home, so tired I could barely stand, but still forced myself to cook him dinner, to check his homework, to listen to his stories, because I wanted him to feel safe and loved. I thought of the mornings when I rose before dawn, packing his lunch before heading off to a job that drained every ounce of strength from me, yet I went willingly, because I believed my son's future was worth more than my comfort. I thought of the years when I paid his tuition, covered his rent, bought his clothes, and watched him grow with pride, never once asking for thanks, never once imagining that the day would come when all of it would be dismissed with a single sentence. The silence wrapped itself around me tighter with each memory, but instead of crushing me, it began to change me. At first it was the silence of despair, the kind that tells you everything you believed in has been a lie, but slowly it became the silence of clarity, a silence that whispered truths I had long avoided. It told me that love, given without respect, becomes a chain that binds the giver, that sacrifice unacknowledged can turn into exploitation, and that even a father must recognize when his worth is being trampled. I realized then that my collapse was not the end, but the breaking of something that had to be broken, the shattering of an illusion that my son's love was as deep as mine had been. As I lay there in that heavy quiet, my grief hardened into resolve, and though I was too weak to act in that moment, I made a promise to myself that I would not let my story end defined by his betrayal. I would rise from that silent collapse, not as the broken man he believed me to be, but as a father who finally saw the truth clearly and who would find a way to reclaim his dignity. The silence that had once mocked me would become my strength, for it was within that silence that my transformation began, and though my son thought his words had ended me, in truth, they had awakened something far more powerful than he could have imagined. As I lay in that hospital bed with the silence of betrayal still pressing against me, my thoughts drifted back to the one place that had always been my anchor, the house I built with my own 2 hands, the place that carried the story of my sacrifices and the memories of my son's childhood. And as those memories unfolded, I realized that the home itself stood as proof of my worth, even if my son could no longer see it. I remembered the early days when money was scarce and time even scarcer, when I worked long shifts at the factory and then came home to hammer nails by lantern light, my arms aching and my back bent, but my resolve unshaken, because I wanted to give him a roof that no storm could tear away. Every corner of that house carries a memory of my labor. From the wooden floors I sanded smooth until my hands blistered, to the walls I painted with careful strokes, imagining the laughter of my boy echoing through the rooms. I remembered how proud I was when I laid the foundation myself, mixing cement with sweat dripping into the mixture, and how I whispered to myself that this was more than concrete, it was a father's promise set in stone. That home saw the first steps of my son as he wobbled across the living room, his tiny hands reaching for me with trust, and it held his laughter as he played in the yard, chasing the dog until they both collapsed in the grass. It sheltered us during winters when the snow piled high outside, and I stoked the fire to keep him warm, and it sheltered us in summers when the heat pressed down, but I still found ways to make sure he slept comfortably at night. I remembered the dining table I built from old wood, the same table where he sat with his school books while I guided him through math problems, the same table where I counted out coins late at night trying to make rent, and the same table where I celebrated every birthday with a cake I could barely afford, but bought anyway because his smile mattered more to me than any bill. The walls of that house once rang with his voice as he practiced speeches for school, as he shouted in triumph when he passed exams, as he laughed with friends who came over after games, and I thought then that perhaps all my sacrifices had been worth it, that he would one day look back at that home and understand what it meant to be loved so fiercely. Even the yard carries the marks of my devotion, the swing I tied to the old tree where I pushed him higher and higher as he shouted for more, the garden where I planted flowers so his mother's memory would always be alive for him, the small shed I built to store the bicycle I worked overtime to buy. That house was not just wood and stone, it was my life poured out, my sacrifices made visible, and though I lay in a hospital bed with my son's words cutting through me, I found comfort in remembering that the proof of my worth still stood on that plot of land, strong and unwavering even as human hearts faltered. I told myself that walls do not forget, floors do not lie, and every nail I hammered was a testament that I was not a burden but a builder, not worthless but invaluable, and if my son chose to forget, the home would always remember. In that thought, I found strength, because I realized that no words of dismissal could erase what I had created, and though betrayal had shaken me, it could not erase the foundation I had built with my hands and my love. That home was my monument, and as I remembered every board, every brick, and every drop of sweat that went into it, I promised myself that I would not allow the man who grew up inside those walls to convince me that my worth had vanished. For the very house he still claimed as part of his life was the undeniable proof that his father's sacrifices had never been in vain. As I lay in that hospital bed, drifting between the sting of my son's words and the memories of the home I had built with my own 2 hands, a moment of clarity began to rise within me, and it was in that quiet realization that I found the turning point of my story. The moment when sorrow no longer defined me and resolve took its place. For days I had carried the weight of his betrayal like a stone pressing against my chest, replaying his voice telling the doctor I was not worth saving. But as the hours stretched into long nights filled with the hum of machines and the distant footsteps of nurses, I began to see the truth with a clarity sharper than pain. I understood then that love without respect is nothing more than a chain, and I had been bound by that chain for too long, mistaking sacrifice for devotion, when in reality it had turned me into an endless resource for a son who no longer valued me as a father. I thought of the years I had given, of the food I had skipped, the shifts I had worked, the money I had poured into his future, and I realized that while I had seen it as love, he had come to see it as obligation, as if everything I had done was nothing more than what he was entitled to receive. That realization was not just painful, it was liberating, because it stripped away the illusions I had clung to, the illusions that he still cherished me, that he still saw me as the man who raised him with love and sacrifice. I understood then that my story did not have to end in humiliation, that the final chapter of my life would not be defined by being cast aside in a hospital room, because I still held something far greater than his words. I held the truth of what I had built, the strength of what I had endured, and the quiet power to take back what had been mine all along. I no longer saw myself as a frail old man waiting for permission to exist. I saw myself as a man who had carried another on his shoulders for too long, and now it was time to set that weight down. The turning point came not with anger but with resolve, not with shouting but with silence, as I promised myself that once I left that hospital I would no longer live bound by the expectations of a son who dismissed me. I would live on my own terms, reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from me. I vowed that he would learn the true weight of his words, not because I would scream at him or beg him to see my worth, but because I would show him what life without my support truly looked like. Every sacrifice I had made, every financial lifeline I had extended, every safety net I had built, I now saw clearly as threads I could pull away, threads that once woven together had formed the fabric of his life. And if I chose to unravel them, there would be nothing left for him to cling to but the consequences of his arrogance. The turning point was the death of illusions and the birth of resolve, and as I stared at the ceiling with the machines marking each breath, I whispered silently to myself that the man they thought was too weak to fight back would rise again, not with rage but with patience, not with fury but with precision. And in time my son would learn that a father's worth is not his to decide, for my worth was written in every sacrifice I had made, and the moment I chose to reclaim it, no power on earth could take it from me. When I was finally discharged from the hospital and returned to the quiet of my own home, I knew that the time had come to begin the work I had promised myself during those long nights of reflection, and so I set out carefully, silently, like a man moving chess pieces in a game his opponent did not even know had begun, starting with quiet investigations that would reveal just how deeply my son still depended on me. I pulled out the old metal box where I kept documents, contracts, bank statements, and loan agreements, papers that I had signed over the years without hesitation because I believed I was building his future. And as I spread them across the table, I began to see the web of obligations more clearly than I ever had before. My name was everywhere, written in ink alongside his, on co-signed loans that gave him access to credit he never would have qualified for on his own, on property agreements that linked my assets to his stability, on accounts that quietly funneled money toward his debts, without him ever realizing how much I was covering. I felt a mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction as I traced my finger over each line, sorrow that my sacrifices had been turned into chains binding me to a son who no longer respected me, and satisfaction that I now held in my hands the proof of his dependence. I decided I needed professional guidance, so I called upon an old lawyer I trusted, a man who had once helped me navigate the darkest financial storms of my life. And when I sat in his office, surrounded by shelves of dusty books, I told him everything. I explained what had happened in the hospital, the words my son had spoken, the silence that had followed, and I watched as his professional demeanor faltered just enough to reveal the outrage he felt on my behalf. He leaned forward, his voice steady, and assured me that I still had options, that I was far from powerless, and together we began to chart a path toward reclaiming what was mine. He guided me through the process of disentangling my name from those obligations, step by careful step, showing me how to withdraw my guarantees, how to close accounts, how to secure my assets so they could no longer be touched by my son's hands. From there I visited my banker, a woman I had known for years, and she greeted me with kindness as I explained that I wanted to review every account linked to me, every payment leaving my pocket, and as she pulled up the records on her screen, I saw in black and white how much of my son's supposed independence had been propped up by me. Each automatic transfer that had slipped by unnoticed, each quiet deposit I had made, each shared account where my money had acted as a safety net, they all stared back at me, undeniable proof that I was still the foundation of his life. I asked her how I could redirect and protect what was mine, and she explained the steps patiently, showing me how to close what needed to be closed, how to shield what needed to be shielded, and with every signature I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. These quiet investigations did more than reveal the truth of his dependence. They reminded me that I was not the helpless old man my son believed me to be, but a man still capable of shaping outcomes, still capable of standing tall even in the final chapters of his life. I returned home with folders filled with notes and instructions, placed them neatly on my table, and sat in the stillness of my house, breathing deeply as I realized that the plan was already in motion. My son had believed he could cast me aside without consequence, but he had not realized how tightly his future was still tied to mine, and as I prepared to take the next steps, I promised myself that I would move with patience and precision, allowing him to walk forward confidently into the trap of his own arrogance, until the day came when the truth would fall upon him like a weight he could not escape. As I dug deeper into the records, with the guidance of my lawyer and banker, the picture that emerged before me was clearer and more damning than I had ever imagined. For every page, every line of ink, every contract and statement revealed a web of dependence so intricate that it became almost laughable to think my son had stood in that hospital room and declared me not worth saving when in truth so much of his life had been held up by me. I saw how the co-signed loan he boasted about to friends, claiming it as proof of his financial independence, was in fact built entirely upon my credit history, my decades of paying bills on time, my careful saving, and without my signature that loan never would have been granted. I traced the property records and found that my name still lingered there, not as an afterthought but as a guarantor that allowed him to live in a home he could not have afforded otherwise, a home where he entertained guests proudly, never once admitting that the father he dismissed had been the one to make the purchase possible. I looked over the bank statements and saw again the steady stream of transfers that had gone from my account into his over the years, small enough at times to escape notice, but constant enough to keep him afloat when his spending outpaced his earning. Even his business ventures, the ones he liked to brag about as though they were the product of his genius, bore the fingerprints of my support. Deposits I had made quietly, loans I had covered when payments came late, and introductions I had facilitated with people willing to give him a chance only because they respected me. The deeper I looked, the more undeniable it became that his supposed independence was nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed illusion propped up by the silent sacrifices I had made. And yet, as painful as that realization was, it also filled me with a kind of grim satisfaction because it meant that I still held the power he thought he had stripped from me. I sat at my table, documents spread before me like a map of our lives, and I realized that every thread of that web could be cut by my hand. He thought he had freed himself from me, thought he had risen above the man who raised him, but he had not realized that the ground beneath his feet was still mine to hold or mine to take away. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the truth settle in, and I felt something I had not felt in months: control. For too long, I had lived under the shadow of his arrogance, enduring the small humiliations, swallowing the disrespect, convincing myself that love meant acceptance. But now I understood that real love cannot thrive without respect, and respect must be earned, not assumed. My son had failed that test, and now the illusion of his success was ready to collapse under its own weight once I chose to step back. The web of dependence he had woven around me was both his strength and his weakness, and I knew that when I began to cut those threads, he would finally see how fragile his world truly was. I thought again of that moment in the hospital, of his voice telling the doctor I was not worth saving, and I whispered into the quiet of my home that it was not my worth that needed to be measured but his. And soon he would be weighed against the truth of what he had taken for granted. Every father hopes his child will stand tall on his own one day, but I realized that my son had never truly stood. He had only leaned, and now that leaning would lead to his fall, because the web that had held him would no longer hold once I decided to let it unravel thread by thread. Once I fully understood the depth of my son's dependence on me, I knew that knowledge alone was not enough, for awareness without action is little more than regret. So I began to form a strategic plan that would turn my clarity into justice. A plan crafted not with rage or haste, but with the patience of a man who has endured a lifetime of hardship and knows that the most powerful blows are delivered slowly and deliberately. I started by organizing every document, every account, every contract that tied me to his life, spreading them across my table until they formed a map of my past sacrifices and his present illusions. And I studied them like a general preparing for battle, noting where to strike first and where to hold back until the moment was right. My lawyer advised me to move carefully, reminding me that once I began cutting away those ties, there would be no turning back, and I assured him that I had no intention of retreat, for the boy who once clung to me for protection had grown into a man who dared to declare I was not worth saving, and that was a wound I would not let heal without leaving its lesson behind. The first step was to close the accounts that had long acted as hidden lifelines, quiet transfers that had flowed into his world without notice, and I felt a strange satisfaction as I signed the forms to stop them, knowing that soon he would feel the sudden weight of bills that no longer disappeared on their own. Next, I instructed my lawyer to begin the process of removing my name from the co-sign loans, a move that would force the bank to re-examine his worth alone And I could already imagine the shift in tone when they realized that without me, he was not the reliable client they had believed. From there, I prepared to alter the property records, ensuring that what I had worked for would remain in my hands and not slip into his through the arrogance of assumption. And though it pained me to think of how far I had to go to protect what was mine, I reminded myself that dignity must be guarded as fiercely as wealth. Each step of the plan was designed not only to reclaim what was mine, but to reveal to him the truth he had long ignored, that his life had been built not on his own strength, but on the sacrifices of the father he had dismissed. I moved with caution, leaving no detail unchecked, consulting with professionals who spoke to me with respect, and their steady voices reminded me that I was not alone in this, that even if my son no longer valued me, there were still those who recognized the strength of a man who took control of his fate. At night I sat at my table with the papers neatly stacked, signing where I needed to sign, writing notes in the margins, checking figures twice, and though the work was exhausting, it filled me with a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. This was not about vengeance for its own sake. It was about balance, about ensuring that my final chapters would not be written by a son who had lost his way, but by me, the man who had carried him for so long. I reminded myself that every father has the right to expect respect, and when that respect is denied, he has the right to withdraw the support that has been taken for granted. With each decision, I felt my resolve harden, and I whispered into the quiet of my house that soon my son would understand the weight of his words, because the very ground he walked upon was about to be pulled away. My strategic plan was not the fury of a moment, but the patient design of a lifetime. And as I prepared the final steps, I felt peace in knowing that when the time came, justice would not roar like thunder, but fall with the quiet certainty of a truth that could no longer be denied. While I moved quietly behind the scenes with the patience of a man who had endured decades of sacrifice, my son walked proudly in the open, basking in the illusion of control he had built for himself. And I could almost laugh at the irony of it, because while he strutted through life boasting of his independence, I knew with absolute certainty that every word he spoke was hollow, propped up by supports I was already pulling away. I heard from distant relatives how he spoke confidently about the business ventures he claimed to be running successfully, telling stories of deals secured and profits earned, when in truth I knew that many of those ventures still leaned on funds I had quietly supplied, funds I was now reclaiming without a word. He entertained friends at his home, serving meals on plates that had been purchased with money that once passed through my hands, and he raised glasses of wine in toast to his supposed achievements, never realizing that the roof above his head stood secure only because my name still lingered on the property agreements that gave him legitimacy. He spoke to his wife about the future, as though it were carved in stone, speaking of vacations they would take, investments they would make, and a life of comfort they believed they had earned, while I sat alone in my modest kitchen with papers spread across the table, pulling the threads that would unravel those very plans. The illusion of control gave him confidence, and he mistook my silence as weakness, never suspecting that silence can also be the mark of preparation. He believed he was free of me, that the life he lived was his own creation, and I let him believe it because I wanted the fall to come, not with warning, but with the shock of truth delivered at the moment he least expected it. The arrogance with which he carried himself reminded me of the day in the hospital when he told the doctor I was not worth saving. The certainty in his voice then mirrored in the certainty he now carried into every boastful word. And though it still pained me to remember, I took comfort in knowing that certainty would soon crumble. I watched from afar as he carried himself with pride, and I realized that the illusion of control can be stronger than truth, at least for a time, because when a man convinces himself that he is untouchable, he builds his pride higher and higher, never noticing how fragile the foundation beneath him has become. That fragility was the power I held, and with every quiet step I took to remove my name, my money, and my support, the cracks in his foundation widened, though he could not yet see them. I imagined him smiling at gatherings, shaking hands with confidence, laughing at jokes, never knowing that the smile was temporary, that the confidence was false, that the laughter would soon be silenced by the weight of reality. And in those moments of imagination, I did not feel guilt for what I was doing, because I knew I had given him every chance to honor me, every chance to recognize the years of sacrifice I had poured into his life, and he had chosen arrogance instead. My plan was not to destroy him out of cruelty, but to teach him the truth, and the truth was that he had never truly stood on his own. The illusion of control was his pride, but it would also be his undoing, and I waited patiently for the day when the illusion would crack and he would finally see himself for what he was, not a man who had risen on his own, but a son who had lived his life carried by the father he had declared unworthy. It did not take long for the first signs of collapse to appear once I had withdrawn my hand from the life my son believed was entirely his own, and though I had prepared myself for the moment, there was still a grim satisfaction in seeing how quickly the cracks began to spread through the walls of his illusion, for when a man builds his pride on foundations he did not lay, the moment those foundations are removed, the entire structure begins to crumble. The first ripple came from the bank, where the loan that had once been secured by my name was suddenly reevaluated, and within days, letters arrived demanding new terms and higher payments that his income alone could not cover. I could almost see the panic in his eyes as he unfolded those letters, the arrogance he wore like armor beginning to chip away under the pressure of numbers that no longer added up. Not long after, the vendors from his wedding, who had been patient for years because my deposits had kept them calm, began sending notices demanding the balances still owed, their patience gone now that my guarantees had been quietly withdrawn. His mailbox, once filled with invitations and congratulations, now became cluttered with bills and demands, and each envelope carried the weight of truths he could no longer ignore. Then came the utilities, the small but relentless bills that had always been covered by the quiet transfers I had arranged. And now, without those lifelines, the accounts began to fall behind, late fees stacking like bricks in a wall that grew higher by the week. Whispers followed soon after, as friends and acquaintances who had admired his image of success began to notice the strain, the missed payments, the nervousness in his voice when the subject of money arose. And whispers have a way of spreading faster than truth itself. I heard from distant relatives that his wife's smile had grown tight and forced, that arguments were erupting in their home, and I knew that the walls of pride he had built so high were beginning to buckle under the weight of reality. Each sign of collapse was another reminder that his world had been an illusion, and without my support the illusion could not hold. I pictured him sitting at his dining table late at night, bills scattered around him, his confidence shattered, his mind racing for solutions he could not find. And though part of me felt sorrow for the boy he once was, another part of me felt peace, because this was not punishment without cause. It was consequence born of truth. For years he had taken without gratitude, spoken without respect, lived without acknowledgement of the man who had built his life. And now he faced the world on his own terms, the very thing he had claimed he wanted. The first signs of collapse were not loud explosions but quiet unravelings. the kind that eat away at pride little by little until even the strongest voice begins to tremble. And I knew this was only the beginning. Soon, the facade would fall completely, and when it did, he would finally understand what it meant to live without the foundation of a father's sacrifices. I sat in my own home, sipping coffee as I read my newspaper, and I thought of the irony that while he once believed I was the one clinging to life with nothing left to offer, he was now the one clinging to an illusion with nothing left to hold. The collapse had begun, and though I watched from a distance, I felt its tremors as clearly as if I were there, and I whispered to myself that this was justice, not vengeance, because justice is simply truth allowed to do its work. As the first signs of collapse tightened their grip around my son's carefully built facade, panic inevitably followed, and though I was not there to witness every moment, I could imagine it vividly because I had lived long enough to know the look of a man drowning in problems of his own making, and from the stories that reached my ears, it was clear that he was thrashing desperately as the waters closed in. His confidence, once unshakable, began to falter in front of others, his voice no longer carrying the same weight when he spoke of his supposed successes. And friends who once admired him now exchanged uneasy glances when he entered a room, sensing the cracks behind the smile he tried so hard to maintain. I knew the letters from creditors must have stacked high on his kitchen table, each envelope a reminder that the world was no longer held up by my silent sacrifices, and I pictured him sitting there late at night, his head buried in his hands, his wife pacing angrily as arguments rose between them, both of them realizing that the foundation they had taken for granted had vanished. Panic has a way of stripping a man of his pride, and I could see it happening through every report I heard as his bluster turned into excuses, his arrogance into defensiveness, and his certainty into denial. He began lashing out at those around him, blaming the economy, blaming the banks, blaming anyone but himself, yet all the while knowing deep inside that the truth was simpler and more painful, that the father he had declared unworthy was the one who had kept him standing all along. I could almost hear the anger in his voice when he argued with his wife, shouting about bills he could not pay, about promises he could not keep, and I imagined the fear in her silence as she realized that the man she had married was not the pillar of strength he had pretended to be, but a boy still leaning on the shoulders of his father. The panic grew with each passing day, and I knew it because desperation began to replace arrogance, his tone shifting from one of superiority to one of confusion, as though he could not understand how quickly his world was crumbling. But I understood, for I had built that world piece by piece, and now I was unbuilding it thread by thread until only the truth remained. The son who had told a doctor that I was not worth saving was now scrambling to save himself, and though part of me ached to know that he was suffering, another part of me felt calm, because this was the only way he would ever see the reality of his choices. Panic does not arrive quietly. It consumes every part of a man, and I knew it must have been consuming him now. His days filled with frantic phone calls, his nights sleepless, his dreams haunted by the collapse of the image he had once cherished. I sat in my home with the steady tick of the clock beside me, sipping my tea, and thought of the irony that while I had been called a burden, I now lived in peace while he, the one who dismissed me, carried the true burden of consequence. I did not rejoice in his suffering, but I did not pity it either, because pity is wasted on those who refuse to see the truth, and until he saw it clearly for himself, panic would remain his constant companion. It was only a matter of time before panic pushed him to the place I had known he would eventually reach, the place where he could no longer pretend, the place where he would have to come to me not with arrogance, but with desperation. And though I was prepared for that moment, I resolved that my silence would speak louder than any words I could offer. It happened just as I knew it would, because panic eventually strips away pride until there is nothing left but desperation. And when the phone rang late one evening, and I lifted the receiver to hear my son's voice trembling on the other end, I knew that the moment had arrived when arrogance had finally collapsed into pleading. And though I had prepared myself for this, the sound of him breaking still struck me with a mixture of sorrow and vindication. He began quickly, words tumbling over themselves, his voice strained and filled with an urgency I had not heard since he was a child crying out for comfort in the dark. Only now his cries were not for monsters beneath the bed, but for creditors at the door, for bills piling high, for a wife who had grown cold with frustration, and for a life unraveling faster than he could gather the threads. He told me how everything was falling apart, how the bank had called in the loan with new terms he could not meet, how vendors were threatening legal action over unpaid balances, how friends were beginning to whisper, and how he could not see a way forward without my help. He tried to soften his plea with words of affection, calling me father in a tone that sounded rehearsed, saying he had not meant what he said in the hospital, saying it was fear that made him speak those words, saying that he loved me and that he needed me. But even as he spoke, I could hear the hollow ring of convenience in his voice, the way his declarations were not born of love but of necessity. I listened in silence, letting his words wash over me, my fingers gripping the receiver tightly, my chest heavy with the memories of all I had done for him, and I asked myself if even a fraction of his plea was sincere. He begged me to reconsider, begged me to help him one more time, begged me to step in and save him from the consequences he now faced. And for a moment I thought of the boy he once was, the boy whose tears I wiped away, the boy I held through storms, the boy I promised I would protect, and my heart ached with the memory. But then I remembered the hospital. I remembered the certainty in his voice when he told the doctor I was not worth saving, and I remembered the silence that followed when he chose not to defend me. And those memories reminded me that desperation now did not erase betrayal then. My silence grew heavier with each second, and I knew he felt it, because his words began to falter, his tone shifting from pleading to frustration, from frustration to panic once more, as though he could not understand why I did not rush to rescue him as I always had before. But that was the point. That was the lesson. Because fathers who give endlessly without demand for respect only teach their children to take, and I had already given enough. I let the silence stretch. I let him feel its weight. I let him realize that this time there would be no rescue. And though part of me wept inside, another part stood tall, because I knew that only through consequence would he ever see the truth of what he had done. Finally his voice broke, a whisper of my name spoken like a man grasping at the last thread, but I did not answer. I simply lowered the receiver slowly back onto its cradle, and the click of that final sound echoed through the room like a closing door. I sat there afterward in the stillness of my home, the air thick with both sorrow and resolve, and I knew I had chosen the only path that could teach him what words alone never could. The desperate plea had come, but my silence was the only answer, because it spoke louder than any lecture, louder than any punishment, louder than any act of pity ever could. And in that silence, I found my strength once again. The confrontation I had long anticipated came soon after the desperate plea, because desperation does not rest quietly, and pride, even when cracked, still pushes a man to demand answers. So, one afternoon, there was a knock at my door, and when I opened it, I saw my son standing there, with eyes dark from sleepless nights and shoulders slumped beneath the weight of burdens he could not carry. And beside him his wife lingered, her face etched with worry, though she spoke no words, as they stepped hesitantly into the house I had built. They sat across from me at the same table where my son had once spread out his homework, while I guided him through lessons. The same table where we once shared meals of simple bread and soup. The same table where I counted coins late at night to pay for his tuition, and now it became the place where truth would finally be spoken, without the shield of arrogance or the veil of excuses. He began with anger, his voice raised as he demanded to know why the banks had turned on him, why creditors were circling, why payments once covered with ease now weighed on him like chains. And though his tone carried echoes of the arrogance I had always known, beneath it was fear, a tremor that betrayed how close he was to breaking. I let him speak, his words spilling into the air with the frantic rhythm of a man trying to blame anyone but himself, until at last his voice cracked and his anger dissolved into pleading once more, and he begged me to explain what was happening. I leaned forward, my hands folded on the table, and with a calmness that came not from cruelty but from certainty, I told him I had heard every word he spoke in that hospital room, that I had lain there too weak to move, yet strong enough to hear him tell a doctor that his father was not worth saving, and I watched the color drain from his face as the weight of my words struck him. His wife turned sharply toward him, her eyes wide in shock, and in that moment silence filled the room heavier than any noise could. I told him that for years I had carried him, that every loan, every home, every account he claimed as his own was built on the sacrifices of the father he had dismissed, and that when he chose to erase me from his life with those words, I chose to erase my name from the structures that had held him up. I explained how I had withdrawn my guarantees, how I had closed the accounts, how I had severed the ties that kept him safe, and I spoke each detail not with rage but with measured clarity, because I wanted him to see that this was not vengeance in a fit of anger, but justice crafted with patience. He tried to interrupt, stammering excuses about fear, about misunderstanding, about not meaning what he said, but I raised my hand, and his words fell silent, because the time for excuses had long passed. I looked directly into his eyes and told him that a father is not a burden, a father is not disposable, a father is the foundation upon which a child's life is built, and when that foundation is disrespected, it has the right to withdraw its strength. My daughter-in-law lowered her head, tears sliding down her cheeks, while my son sat frozen, his pride shattered, his illusions broken, forced to face the truth, that he had mocked the very man who had given him everything. The confrontation did not end with shouting, it ended with silence, the silence of truth laid bare, and I watched as he sat before me, stripped of arrogance, stripped of excuses, left only with the reality of his actions. And though part of me ached to see him so broken, a greater part of me felt peace, because I knew that at last he understood that the father he declared not worth saving had always been the one saving him. When the confrontation ended and my words hung in the air like stones too heavy to be moved, I could see the illusion my son had clung to for so many years shatter before my eyes. And though I had imagined this moment countless times, the reality of watching pride collapse into dust was both painful and necessary, for it was only then that he could truly understand what he had done. He sat slumped at my table, the same table where I once taught him how to write his name. His head bowed as if the weight of his arrogance had finally crushed him, and I studied his face searching for the boy I once knew. The boy who once smiled at me with trust and ran to me with joy, but that boy was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a man stripped bare of his illusions. His wife sat beside him in silence, her eyes wet with tears as she tried to reconcile the man she thought she had married with the truth that had been revealed. and I could see her shoulders trembling as she realized that their life of comfort had not been built on his strength but on mine. The room was filled with silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall, each tick marking the end of another piece of pride that fell away from him. I thought of the image he had presented to the world, the confident host at dinners, the boastful voice in conversations, the man who carried himself as though success had been his alone, and I realized how fragile it all was, how quickly it crumbled when the truth was spoken. For years he had convinced himself and others that he had built his life with his own hands. But now, faced with the evidence of my sacrifices and the withdrawal of my support, he could no longer deny that the foundation had always been mine. His arrogance was gone, replaced by humiliation, and humiliation has a way of cutting deeper than anger, for it leaves a man exposed not only to others, but to himself. I watched him shift uncomfortably in his chair, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words coming out, because there were no words left to defend himself, no excuses strong enough to cover the truth. He had mocked me, dismissed me, and declared me unworthy, yet now he sat broken in the house of the man he had called a burden, forced to acknowledge that his entire world had been carried by the father he had tried to erase. I did not gloat. I did not rejoice, because this was not about winning, it was about truth. And truth has no need for celebration, it simply stands unshaken once revealed. My son's illusion lay shattered at his feet, and though he tried to gather the pieces, I knew they would never fit together again, because once pride is broken by truth, it cannot be rebuilt on lies. His wife wept softly, her hand resting on his arm as if to steady him. But even her touch could not mend the fracture between who he believed he was and who he now knew himself to be. I felt both sorrow and peace as I watched. Sorrow for the bond that had been lost, peace for the dignity I had reclaimed. The shattered illusion was not only his, it was mine as well, for I too had believed for too long that my sacrifices were building a man of honor, when in truth, they had built a man who thought he could stand without recognizing the ground beneath him. Now that illusion was gone, and in its place stood the raw reality of betrayal, consequence, and clarity. My son had finally seen himself in the mirror of truth, and though it broke him, it also freed me. For no longer could he hide behind pride, no longer could he deny what I had always known, that his strength was borrowed, his successes inherited, and his life built upon the back of the father he had declared not worth saving. Vindication did not come to me in the form of applause or recognition. It came quietly, steadily, like the calm after a storm, and it filled me with a peace I had not known in years, because, for the first time since my son's betrayal in that hospital room, I felt the weight of his judgment fall away, and the truth of my worth stand unshaken. As he sat across from me, his pride broken and his illusions scattered, I no longer saw myself as the helpless old man who had been called unworthy. I saw myself as the man who had given everything and who finally stood acknowledged by the force of reality itself. My vindication was not in his humiliation, though I saw it clearly in his bowed head and trembling hands. It was in the certainty that he now understood the truth, that without me there was no life of comfort, no image of success, no foundation to stand on. I told him calmly that I had never been a burden, that every roof he had slept under, every book he had studied, every opportunity he had claimed as his own had been built upon my sacrifices, and though he had chosen to dismiss me, those sacrifices could not be erased. I reminded him of the nights I worked through exhaustion so he could eat, the days I skipped meals so he could have new shoes, the years I spent carrying the weight of bills and debts so he could walk freely into his future, and I watched as each word sank deeper into his silence. He could not argue. He could not deny it, because the evidence had already stripped him of every excuse. My vindication was in that silence, the silence of truth being absorbed, the silence of a man realizing that his arrogance had not only failed him, but revealed him for what he truly was. His wife sat beside him, her eyes downcast, and though she did not speak, I could sense her shame as well, the shame of realizing that she had looked at me through the lens of his arrogance rather than through the reality of my devotion. I told them both that I no longer carried anger. That anger was a fire that burned the one who held it. But what I carried now was resolve, the resolve to live the rest of my life free from the chains of their entitlement. Vindication meant that I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their gratitude, because I had reclaimed the dignity they had tried to strip from me, and that was enough. I sat back in my chair, my hands steady, my voice calm, and I felt as though the years of sacrifice that once weighed on me had transformed into pillars of strength, reminders that I had been more than enough all along. For too long I had let their dismissive tones, their arrogance, their silence convince me that perhaps I had failed as a father, but now I saw clearly that it was not failure on my part but blindness on theirs, and that truth was my vindication. My son finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, and in them I saw not the defiance of arrogance, but the recognition of a man humbled. And though he did not speak, his silence was an admission greater than any words. I rose from my chair slowly, feeling the ache of age in my bones, but standing taller than I had in years, and I told him that respect is not given by obligation, it is earned, and that until he could offer it, he would stand alone. Vindication was not about revenge, it was about balance. And I felt that balance restored as I watched him sit there, unable to deny the truth any longer. I turned away then, not with bitterness but with peace, because I knew that my dignity was intact, and nothing he could say or do would ever take it from me again. When the dust finally settled and the echoes of our confrontation faded into silence, I found myself sitting once more in the stillness of my home, the same home I had built with sweat and sacrifice, and for the first time in years, that silence did not feel heavy or suffocating. It felt calm, steady, almost like a companion, reminding me that peace can return even after betrayal. I looked around at the walls that had held the laughter of my son's childhood, the ceilings that had sheltered us through storms, the table that had carried the weight of both joy and sorrow, and I realized that while people may forget, houses remember. And every board and nail still whispered the truth of who I was and what I had given. I no longer carried the ache of his words from the hospital, for I had replaced that wound with the certainty of my worth, a worth that could never again be defined by his arrogance. My days became simple and honest, filled with small routines that reminded me life is not measured by grandeur, but by dignity, brewing coffee in the early mornings, tending to the garden in the afternoons, sitting quietly with books in the evenings, and through it all feeling lighter because I was no longer bound to the endless cycle of giving without respect. I thought often of my son, of the way he had looked at me with silence when confronted, and I wondered if in his heart he had begun to understand, if the weight of truth had finally taught him that a father's love is not infinite when met with betrayal, that respect must flow both ways or it crumbles into dust. whether he understood or not, no longer chained me, because I had done my part. I had raised him, I had given, I had built, and now I had reclaimed what was mine. My story had begun with betrayal in a hospital room, but it did not end there. It ended here, in the quiet dignity of a man who chose to rise rather than be erased. I found peace in knowing that I had faced the worst words a father could hear, and yet I had not allowed them to define me. I had turned them into the fuel for my resolve, and I had emerged stronger. I found resolution in the simple truth that love without respect is hollow, and that it is better to stand alone in dignity than to be surrounded by those who take without gratitude. As I sat by the window one evening, watching the sun sink behind the trees, I whispered to myself that my life had meaning, not because of what others said, but because of what I had built, endured, and reclaimed. And in that whisper I found peace. And now, as I close this chapter of my journey, I want to thank you for walking beside me through every moment of it, for listening to the story of a father who refused to be erased. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.